So hello and welcome to our podcast for ArtAp, our ArtAp class. And yeah, today in our podcast we'll be talking about the definitions of museums and our experience in the National Museum of Fine Arts in Manila.
So one of the main questions we'll be answering is what should be the definition of a museum? So for almost 50 years, the International Council of Museums has defined the museum as a non-profit institution that acquires, conserves, researches, communicates, and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purposes of education, study, and enjoyment. However, given the different viewpoints, events, and realizations by different scholars and even artists of our world today, what should it mean now? So, for our podcast, we'll be talking about the National Museum, our experiences in it, and we'll be examining different works and also telling our personal experiences, all in pursuit of arriving at our own definition of a museum.
So, like what Kyla said, the museum we went to for this podcast is the National Museum of Fine Arts in Manila, right? And it's an institution by the government, and it is an educational, scientific, and cultural institution that acquires, documents, preserves, exhibits, and fosters scholarly study and public appreciation of works of art, specimens, and cultural historical artifacts representative of our unique cultural heritage of the Filipino people and the natural history of the Philippines. So with that, I think when we were going around the museum, it was really large and there was like a variety of paintings, like from botanical paintings to classical paintings to sculptures, modern art. So with that, I think we should start with probably the most famous painting in the museum, which is the Spolarium by Juan Luna.
So we actually, from viewing the Spolarium, we can actually recall that we discussed it briefly in our ArtAp class. We were given a brief background as to why Juan Luna, the artist, painted it, and also like kind of the main message of the painting. So, in summary or generally, he's a Filipino ilustrado, so meaning he was one of those one of the Filipinos who was fortunate enough to go to Spain and study there. And it was actually his painting was an allusion to the rule of Spanish colonizers in the Philippines, and he did this as his part and share in the movement of the propaganda.
Upon our entrance in the museum, we were faced right away with the famous painting of Juan Luna, the Spolarium, and we were surprised to see how really big and tall it was, because it's different seeing it in its actual physical form than just viewing it online, on screens, and in photos and such. So, we have observed that the colors he used were really dark and vivid, and to me, that displayed a lot of sad emotions. There was blood, there was obvious violence, and I think that depicted the tragic happenings, scenes, and real life events that were present during that time. And they were that emotionally powerful that Juan Luna was able to paint such a tragic painting.
Yeah, and in relation to our experiences in the museum, we were kind of surprised to see people smiling with the painting because it was as if they didn't understand the context in which why the painting was painted, and it was like to reflect the dark times of the Spanish colonial period. But then people were really happy to see it and even pose with it, and like um, from the start till the end of the art tour in the museum, there were a lot of people taking happy photos with the paint.
So it was mentioned that we saw a lot of people taking photos and posing with the paintings and sculptures, but we also realized that even though they were taking photos and our group looking around the paintings also appreciated the educational value of the paintings, we realized that these were both forms of social capital. For the group taking photos or taking selfies even with the paintings, it was their way of appreciating the art. And for us, even though we did take photos, it was for educational purposes. And our viewing of the paintings was also guided by our background knowledge on certain historical facts and events that we learned in school.
Other than the spolarium, the museum had a lot of other galleries with different concepts. But one thing that really caught my attention was the history of Manila, a mural-like artwork in the old Senate Hall depicting the PH history. I was able to see different important historic events that I learned in my history classes. It was really amusing to actually see a timeline-like view of the Philippine history in the form of art, especially in the old Senate Hall. The overall view of the painting with the structures of the old Senate Hall was actually the most memorable scene that I still have in my mind from the museum.
Okay, so in connection with this, I think we could say that the galleries in the National Museum and the artworks like in them generally portray the like Philippine history as the artist saw them. So one gallery in particular in which this was more evident was Gallery 8, the Silvina and 1C Laya Hall, which was a gallery devoted to a bunch of paintings created by Filipino artists during the World War II period, showcasing the different sufferings and atrocities that they had to go through during this era. So some paintings, for example, this painting entitled "The Rape and Massacre in Ermita" showcases Japanese soldiers, um, basically raping a woman in the painting, and it's very morbid. But then, these types of paintings and the scenes that are being shown are like they were once true and they actually happened. So, um, the description of the gallery actually gives a warning saying that this gallery contains graphic images that may be disturbing to some viewers. And I guess this is something that we really cannot avoid because, as I said, it's something that we experienced in the past, and it's actually very courageous of the artist to go and depict these atrocities, especially because in those times, any form of like rebellion against what was happening could cost them some jail time or even their own lives.
The first thing we noticed as soon as we entered the Hookah's gallery was its dark, eerie atmosphere, as it played background voices resembling that of a monastery's. In relation to narrating Philippine history, this gallery walked us through the prevalence of religion in our country. There were paintings and illustrations of the first ever mass held among the Igorots, the burning of the Bible during the Spanish colonial period, even the execution of Rizal and its effect on the Spanish friars. I noticed that while these artworks had religious subjects, the painters were still able to portray it in such a metaphorical and artistic way that spoke volumes on the negative impacts of the Spanish colonization.
Okay, so I think most of the works or most of the galleries in this museum showcase lots of like artwork that tackled issues related to American, Japanese, and Spanish colonialism. So this particular gallery, which is the social and political commentary after the 1970s, stood out for me because it was it depicted artworks from the social realist movement in the Philippines after the 1970s, and they the artists they tackled issues that were, say, more dear or personal to them. Like for example, Nuna Lucio Alvarado, who is from Negros Occidental, so his artwork dealt with or depicted the faces, the plights, and struggles of the Sacadas, who were Negros-based laborers, and also other marginalized populations.
Okay, so another artist that I remember seeing in that gallery would be Edgar Tulio San Fernandez. So after some research myself, I found out that he's a realist painter, and this actually makes sense because the one artwork he had in that gallery that struck me was his artwork entitled Bihag. So, as the name suggests, it depicts a bihag or a man who is held captive. So, in this painting, like the man is tied by the hands and is naked. So, it was as if he was being tortured. So, this was painted in 1985, and this artwork by Edgar Tulusan Fernandez actually comments on the injustices and oppression experienced by those who spoke against the Marcos regime.
So one of the things that we noticed as a group during our tour in the museum was the evident biases made by the art galleries displayed in the museum. For one thing, there were few galleries that were donated by business institutions, which we thought um, was very biased because the owners of those businesses could reflect their beliefs with the art pieces that they chose to donate. And with that, what people would see were the beliefs of those owners, and they wouldn't be really free to explore and to really learn more about the whole story of the reasons why those artworks were made, which was why it was very biased for us.
So one of the galleries that was actually sponsored by a corporation was the Film Life Hall, and according to their website, it was actually the Life Hall was open in 2014, and it had 7 commissioned paintings from the national artist Vicente S. Manansala, who also had different artworks in different galleries in the museum. However, as Lex mentioned earlier, it seems as if when you enter the gallery and you see the name of the corporation, Film Life Hall, it is as if you're able to quickly associate the painting with the corporation itself rather than the true meaning or what you would want or how you would want to interpret the painting yourself. So, in addition to this, you can also say that when a certain business institution sponsors a gallery in a museum, they're able to somehow showcase what their corporation stands for. So you we noticed that in the Film Life Hall, the paintings displayed by Vicente Manansala really displayed how life was in the Philippines and how it was very colorful and somehow very idealistic, and this is in line with the vision and mission and the some also the goals of Film Life, which is being committed to genuinely engage with their customers through meaningful dialogue, and they did this through displaying the art, and from this they will also be able to somehow target a wider audience, because when people see the sponsorship by Film Life Hall, they will be able to know more about the corporation itself rather than actually focusing on the true meanings of the paintings.
In contrast to all the historical and cultural art we saw, it was nice to also be able to see modern art. So, in terms of abstract art, I got really surprised to see H.R. Ocampo's works because I remembered researching about him before for a group's report regarding the American colonial period. So, because modern art started to use different styles and forms of expression, H.R. Ocampo emphasized more on color harmony, and because of our background knowledge on this, we were able to appreciate it because we were able to somehow understand it in comparison to the other people in the National Museum who were much more intrigued with historical art, which we could tell because they weren't really interested in taking pictures with the modern art.
Another interesting one is MP Pilapil's temporary exhibit entitled Circa, featuring many artworks that were made out of different materials such as wood, steel, and marble. Most of the artworks were in form of solid sculptures that were very unique and creative. I reached this exhibit at almost towards the end of the museum tour, but I was still very intrigued by the unexpected use of materials and the creative outputs. Actually, it is really difficult to understand most of the artworks in relation to their title. For example, the white circular clock-like pieces hanging on the wall was the first ones to be seen. Those were actually a series of sculptures entitled Gestures of Life. Also, one of the rock sculptures with steel embedded in it is entitled Grit. Both artworks are very pleasing to the eyes, but in a sense, abstract and vague to interpret. And I think that these artworks are just entertainment for the audience compared to the other historical artworks because people really didn't know the context behind those works.
In relation to what Roy said about not knowing the context of some art, we learned that the difficult way. in terms of the Commonwealth sculpture by Guillermo Tolentino. So the what happened was Alex and I were taking photos during the museum tour, and then Alex asked me to pose beside one of the sculptures by Guillermo Tolentino. It was regarding the Commonwealth period, and I instinctively put up a peace sign, um, just out of innocence, which we thought was allowed, but then apparently it was not, because afterwards we were reprimanded by the guard. That experience led us to see the importance of knowing the context of a sculpture, because that might have been offensive to what the artist was trying to portray, and it might have been against what he believed in. So not knowing the art and not knowing the context of why it was made really helped us proceed in our museum tour with caution, because like we learned that we can't just do anything we want. We have to we have to be weary with the things that we do around some specific art, just like the Commonwealth sculpture of Guillermo Tolentino. And in addition to that, when we entered, we were also frowned upon, because the receptionist gave us a bad look when we stated that we were from Ateneo. And for the rest of the tour, we felt like we were being like monitored very well, because maybe they thought that we were just there for fun and not for educational purposes. But nonetheless, the whole experience was very useful and was very insightful, because it helped us learn um, the manner in which we should conduct ourselves inside a museum, and it also helped us realize how important context really is in
Okay,
terms of
so
viewing.
in summary, you'll recall that what we talked about historical paintings, and then we moved to certain art movements and sculptures, and we also discussed the gallery sponsored by different corporations. So we also discussed some of the implications and concepts we learned from class, like how art is appreciated. Like for us, we were able to appreciate some artworks more because of our background knowledge on it. However, some of the people we saw simply took photos, and for them, that was how they appreciated art. And then we also discussed capital and art. So you'll notice that we discuss certain concepts relating to it by stating that some of the people who view and who give the paintings to the museums also in a way show off that they have economic capital to possess such art. And then one of the important concepts that we also discussed was the biases that the museum might be able to have by portraying mostly historical paintings and fewer Philippine art movements. And lastly, from Lex's experience, he talked about the importance of knowing context when viewing art. And in addition to this, our experience of getting reprimanded by the guard also talks about the sacredness of how art should be viewed and how art should be respected.
Okay, so with that and with everything that we've discussed and learned about the museum and art in general, it's time for us to answer the question, what should be the definition of a museum? So, to recap, there are currently two debated definitions of a museum. So, the original one by the International Council of Museums says that the museum is a non-profit institution that acquires, conserves, researches, communicates, and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purposes of education, study, and enjoyment. But then they're proposing a new and updated version of the definition of a museum, which would basically just incorporate the mention of human dignity and social justice. So for me, I don't think that museums should actively take a stance on political issues through their programs and through their collections, because if they take a stand, and then there would be a tendency for a bias in terms of the artwork that they'll choose to showcase in their museum. Like, of course, um, they're only gonna pick artworks that kind of match their beliefs or stance on certain issues. Or like museums could also start restricting itself into only showcasing art that intentionally has a political sentiments to it. I think this is similar to how the salon in the 17th century only shows artwork to showcase in their gallery that was in the standards of the academy, like academic art, which which I think was unfair to the artists and also to the viewers, because maybe they're like confined in this idea of what art should be, and also to the artists, because I think every kind of art must be equally showcased. And in addition, I think it's important that we are exposed to the different perspectives of our history, especially through art. Because I think with that, when we're able to understand our history from both sides, by then we'll have like a deeper and a better understanding of the past.
I agree with what Alex just said, because just to emphasize how museums shouldn't really take an active political stand, is that they should emphasize more on educating the public on history or like the culture of a certain country. So, for example, the National Museum, it's actually stated in their objectives that one of their goals is to educate, and they call themselves an educational, scientific, and cultural institution. So from there, you can already see that the National Museum, they strive to really educate the public. And even though, like what we said earlier, is that they focused on historical paintings, it still aims to educate the public, because we notice that some of their galleries actually have like background context to the period that they were displaying. You would be able to see like um, a short explanation on what was happening, whether it was the World War or whether it was just a brief context on the brief context on the personal history of the painter that was being showcased in the gallery.
Okay, so I also agree with like what Kyla was saying. Na museums should be for the like sole purpose of education, and they shouldn't be like imposing a certain political standpoint on people. But then we have to be like we need to understand now this might be a bit hard, or this concept of being solely for educational purposes is in danger, especially with the state of how such museums are being say protected and developed in our country. So a lot like we noticed that a lot of the galleries in the museum were actually like donated by or sponsored by different private institutions. So this is possibly what keeps these museums alive. And though like um like the certain viewpoints of that these private institutions have on social issues may not be implicitly stated in like the gallery descriptions. What the artworks that they have displayed there may be imposing a certain political view, but it's very subtle. It's very subtle. So, in addition to these private institutions, we actually noticed that a lot of the paintings were donated by or loaned by certain individuals and families. So, this says a lot about how, the museum is very dependent on donations. So, one way in which like this could be countered is if museums and other cultural sites could get more government funding. But then, as like I said earlier, this may be hard with the different and other problems that our country is experiencing and need like more focus on.
Okay, so do we think that our chosen museum fulfilled this role or this definition that we think a museum should be? For me, yes, also because I think it's an advantage that the National Museum is very huge compared to like the other museums that the other groups shows, because they really have the space to showcase lots of different artworks by different artists, and also more people can be accommodated at the museum. And in terms of how how is this reflected in their art collection? Obviously, with what we've discussed, there were lots of artworks of different kinds, like from realist to classical paintings to even sculptures to modern art from a variety of different artists from a variety of different time periods. So, yeah.
Another advantage that we recognized was the museum being nationalistic in a sense that they preserved the Senate Hall. And they didn't only preserve it, but they also showed the timeline of Philippine colonialism. And with that, the museum really preserved our culture and our history as Filipinos.
And because we believe that museums should be educational, the artworks and the galleries were classified and arranged in such a way that there was a narrative displayed in terms of Philippine art history. And in relation to this, the National Museum also granted us the freedom to have our own interpretations as well.
Like what Lex said, the reuse of the old Senate building was the part I liked the most. It really felt like the museum itself was also a work of art. It helped us understand the nationalistic message the museum had for us. Also, the division of galleries into different concepts was better for entertainment and educational purposes. When we got to the museum, I saw many groups of students having a field trip. With that, I can really say that the museum is an effective place for education and that the National Museum was able to fulfill its purpose.
So to add to that, the National Museum also caters to the group of people who wants to be more educated about the history and culture of the art in the Philippines, and that there were also tour guides that could be signed up for, and moreover each gallery has short descriptions about the artworks themselves and the paintings so that the people can be guided to the flow of the arts.
Okay, so in conclusion, we believe that museums should be places wherein people may learn a lot, so basically for educational purposes, and that they should not be imposing their own political point of view or standpoint on the audience. So museums are able to do this by storing different artworks that showcase our roots and developments as a country. So it's also up to the museums to showcase different perspectives and different points of view on the different issues being portrayed in the artworks. Because again, we wouldn't want museums to be imposing their own ideas on other people, as we want these ideas to come from the people themselves, as artworks should be up to the interpretation of whoever experiences them.
And just to add to what Andrew said, museums should also be interactive in such a way that though it though it educates the viewer, it also simultaneously evokes the viewer's own interpretations and understandings.
So that's it for our podcast. We hope that you learned a lot, just as much as we did. And we hope that this podcast encourages you to visit the National Museum of Fine Arts. Bye.